Okay, I guess we can start. It's 11 a.m. Let's see. Okay. Well, hello, everybody. Welcome to the Badger Diary Insight. This is the webinar series that we offer every third Tuesday of each month. Welcome, everybody, again. My name is Alison Fao. I'm the bilingual regional dairy educator from UW-Madison Extension. I have 5 counties. I have a big region, so my region is Dane, Dodge, Jefferson, Rock, and Walworth counties. And today we have 2 different speakers, very important information about grazing and about ventilation information. So today we're gonna start with Jason Cavadini, sorry. He's a grazing outreach specialist from UW-Madison Extension. He conducts research, outreach, and educational programming based on perennial forages, livestock integrating cropping systems, and managed grazing for farms of all scales. Jason grew up in the driftless area of Wisconsin, where he developed an appreciation for soil and water conservation farming practices. He obtained a bachelor degree in crops and soil science from University of Wisconsin River Falls and a master in agronomy from Purdue University. Jason is a certified professional agronomist and owns and operates a cow-calf to finish grazing operation with his wife, Jocelyn, and their 5 children. Oh my God, 5 children. Wow, good job. So thank you, Jason, to be here. And now you can start your presentation. Thank you again for being here.
All right, thank you, Allison. And can you see my screen okay?
Yes.
All right, well, thank you for having me to talk about grazing today. We were just talking earlier about how many people signed up for this, and I said, surely grazing isn't that popular, but so we're here to talk about grazing. We're kind of at an interesting point to be talking about it because we're getting very close to the grazing season. We're not quite there yet. There may be some places where grazing is happening and maybe they may have some different forages such as cover crops or something like that. But generally speaking, we're still telling people hold off just a little while longer so you can try to get a good long grazing season. But today we're going to be talking about grazing dairy heifers, and I'm not really sure who all is in the audience and where you're coming from and what your interests are and what your knowledge of grazing is. So this is going to be a little bit of an overview of just kind of this conversation about grazing dairy heifers. It's not going to go very deep into details about exactly how to do it. It's going to touch a little bit on why we're even having this conversation, and then maybe provide some next steps for anyone who may be interested. And the thing that I always say is I've been around a lot this winter talking about this, and over half of the time I'm speaking to people who aren't that interested in grazing and already have their mind made up that that's great, but that's not going to be something I'm going to implement on my operation. And that's perfectly fine. But I would say just for this short time here, I have 30 minutes to talk about this. Maybe just set all that aside and just think about this from the perspective of it's something different, and maybe it has a place in the conversation. And if you can just maybe think like that for a little bit, that could really help the conversation. So let's take a step back just for a minute. So I've been talking about grazing all winter long, but that's my role. But many of you, if you've been to any farm programming around the state, or if you read any agricultural publications, you've likely seen grazing come up. This has been coming up more than it did a decade ago. And so it begs the question, what's with all this talk about grazing? The interesting thing when you think about this is grazing isn't new. It's been around forever. It's one of the oldest forms of livestock agriculture that's on record. But what I want you to hear today, and what we'll talk about a little bit, is grazing isn't old either. The kind of grazing we're talking about specifically isn't old, but a lot of people's mind goes somewhere. They picture something in their mind when they hear the term grazing, because everyone had, not everyone, but a lot of people were not that far removed. Someone has something to tap into in their memory that gives them a picture of grazing. And really, when you think about it, it's part of our roots. And so what the question becomes is grazing. It's part of our roots. And why would we go back to our roots in an industry that's been really focused on moving forward toward the future? Why would we look back to our roots and talk about going back? And so that's what this conversation is really about. And what I really hope people can recognize is it's not really a step backwards, even though it may look like a step going back to our roots. And I also want to be clear that what we aren't saying is everyone needs to graze their heifers. In fact, it's quite the opposite of that. There's people who can't graze heifers under their current setup, and I'm very understanding of that. And there's many others who shouldn't graze heifers because the management isn't quite there. And that's one thing that, as a grazing specialist and some of my colleagues as well, we talk about a lot, is starting the conversation out in a way to find out if grazing is even going to be conducive to the management that that farm or farmer has. And there's instances where it just wouldn't be a good idea. But there's many people who could benefit from grazing, and that's really what this conversation's about. So really, the way that we're talking about grazing is as a solution. Well, a solution to what? I'm going to break it down into 3 categories for this conversation. We're going to look at the costs of raising heifers. We're going to look at the environmental outcomes associated with dairy today. And we're going to look at animal performance. And these tend to be the places where the conversation normally goes when we talk about grazing dairy heifers. So I just picked one example for each one of these. There could be a whole book on each one of these sections, and there actually are, but I'm going to just point out one component of each. So heifer raising costs, kind of always the starting point of the conversation. Back in 2015, when there was a comprehensive survey across the state, the average cost at the time seemed really high. $2.77 per head per day for raising a replacement dairy heifer. In 2023, as we started having more of these conversations, we were hearing farmers cite numbers at $3.15 per head per day. That's farmers who are sending their heifers somewhere else to be raised. So the price is only going up. Now we know that the price is even higher than $3.15 per head per day. We know that 50% of that cost is associated with feed. So the question becomes, how can we improve the cost of feeding dairy heifers? The environmental outcomes. So this is always a topic of conversation. What I'm not trying to do is say dairy is the problem. What I am trying to say is this problem that we're aware of, dairy is part of it in many ways. Dairy production is going to have to figure out how to respond to this. And so that's really what I'm talking about here. But if you look at it, last year, Wisconsin lost 455 dairy farms. 63% of the dairy since 2004 have been lost. But since 2001, the cow numbers have pretty much flatlined. And so even though we're losing all these farms, we're not losing the animals, which tells you that they're all being concentrated in smaller areas. So we also have this phosphorus issue that we're well aware of across the state. 1,500 miles of streams, 33 lakes are impaired with phosphorus, and the estimated cost is around 953 million of that. And we just know that that's going to impact dairy. We know that dairy is a part of it, but we also know that dairy is going to have to respond to it. So the question becomes, how can we improve the environmental outcomes of dairy? Then also, when we have these conversations about grazing dairy heifers, animal performance comes up. So there's the industry recommended growth rate of somewhere in the ballpark of 1.8 pounds of gain per day. We also care about body condition and fitness and reproduction. All these things matter. And we get predictability in the system that is common today. With raising dairy heifers in the confinement model, we can expect what's going to come out in the end. And if something goes awry in the meantime, we're more in control. If we take those animals outside, there's a lot of those factors that are now out of our control, and that makes people very nervous. So the question becomes, how can we improve feed costs and environmental outcomes, those first two, while also sustaining animal performance? So if we try to address those first two at the cost of animal performance, then what's it really worth for the dairy farmer? So these all have to work in harmony. And the question is, can we do that with grazing? So if you look at all three of these, and you think about how much of the focus over the last several decades for the dairy industry has been toward efficiency. How can we create a more efficient system? Well, if we know the heifer raising costs are one of our greatest costs, and we know we can do it cheaper, but we're not, that becomes an efficiency thing. If we see these phosphorus issues, that's a very critical nutrient for our production systems, then maybe we're not being as efficient with our nutrients as we would like to be. And even animal performance as well. If we know there's a way to achieve animal performance outside of the high input model that is currently common, then maybe we're not as efficient as what we've been striving toward. So with all that being said, how can we get grazing into the conversation? And that's exactly what we've been trying to get to the bottom of. So we put quite a bit of effort toward having conversations. We've talked a lot about how great grazing is, but what we haven't done is asked farmers and those who have the greatest influence on farmers why they're not choosing grazing. Because it's very clear, if you look across the landscape, if you go for a drive across Wisconsin, most dairy farmers don't choose grazing anymore. So the question is why? And so we've been having these conversations, asking more questions and giving answers. And it's been very eye-opening for us. So we've asked ag lenders, what's stopping you from presenting grazing to farmers as an economic solution? And then we've asked dairy farmers, what's stopping you from implementing grazing as a soil and nutrient saving solution on your farm? And then we've asked dairy nutritionists, what's stopping you from supporting it as a feeding and performance solution? And really what we're finding is when you have conversations with each one of these separate, you get different answers. But when you bring them all together and facilitate a conversation where everyone's talking in harmony, they don't give reasons to not do it. And they'll even say, we don't question any of the data, any of the reasons that you've shared with us. The biggest thing is we just can't wrap our mind around how to do this because it's been decades since we've done anything like this. And so really what we've unveiled through these efforts is that the perception of grazing is what's the biggest hang up. And so what we've failed to do is distinguish this kind of grazing from where people's minds go when they hear grazing. We've failed to point out that this grazing is different. So that's something that we've really been trying to put more emphasis on lately. I wrote this article that was in Hordes a year ago, just explaining why this grazing is different. And here are a few of the things in that article. What makes managed grazing different than other types of grazing? It starts with the basic principles of managed grazing. So grazing is different than managed grazing. There needs to be emphasis on that term managed. What are we managing? Well, we're managing that forage base. That is our most critical asset for making this system work. So the basic principles of managed grazing we refer to as the 3 R's: rotation, rest, and residual. So for managing that forage base, we want to rotate the animals. We want to give them access to fresh forage and keep them moving. So we recommend rotating every 1 to 3 days. We do that because we want to allow that paddock, that piece of the pasture, to rest for 30 days. It's really no different than how we treat our alfalfa hay fields. We want them to build up root reserves, get really healthy, have become a very high quality forage, harvest that, and then let it rest so we can do it again. And that's how we're treating our pastures. And we do that by maintaining proper residual. We don't ever want to deplete the root reserves and deplete the above ground capability of those plants to keep growing. And so we don't graze lower than 4-inch residual height. And there's a fourth R there, which is rate, for stocking rate. We also call it carrying capacity, but it's basically how many animals we can have on our farm. And none of these, the first 3 R's, are possible if we start out with the wrong stocking rate. So one of the questions that I get most often as a grazing specialist is, how many animals can I have? And that comes back to stocking rate or carrying capacity. And it's a difficult conversation to have because there are so many moving pieces to coming up with that answer. And each one of those are specific to each farm. So stocking rate, if you asked me for your farm, I couldn't tell you, even if it was a mile down the road from my farm in the same soil type and the same growing conditions with all the same forage, I couldn't give you an answer without asking you a bunch of questions first. And so if you take a picture of this QR code here, that'll lead you to this publication that we put together this winter to determine the carrying capacity of your farm. And really what it does is it breaks everything on your farm into these different categories to end up deciding how many animals you can have, depending on the type of livestock, the size of animals, the kind of forage. All of that takes all of that into consideration to get you started on the right foot. Because again, like I said, you can't implement any of the principles of well-managed grazing if you start out with the wrong carrying capacity. So this is something that we're really trying to encourage people to think about. So that's the carrying capacity, but there's other goals. So those were the basic principles of managed grazing. There's other common goals. And this is in no particular order, but we usually depend on a diverse perennial base, consistent yield, high forage quality. We want to maintain low impact on the land so that forage base is always healthy. We have to optimize animal performance if this stands any chance of working at all. We need to minimize the cost of production in order to maximize the economic return. And the one that I have on the bottom is really the big one that we talk about a lot with grazing. And this goes back to carrying capacity, maximizing the grazing season. If we're really gonna realize the economic benefits of this, we need to try to make it last as long as we can and get the most out of it. So this is just a little bit of showing that rotation, residual, and rest and what's behind that. So I'm going to just point out a couple things here without getting too bogged down in data. So this is actually for 20 beef cows, so it's not the best example for dairy heifers, but it's just a point of reference. So this is looking at the frequency of rotation. So a set stocked would be the pasture is the pasture. They're never rotated. They just have access to it. They can take whatever they want every year until it's gone, and then we start feeding hay. That's set stocked. All the way down to daily moves. So this is kind of a gradient of intensity for rotation. And you can see how many acres we need after several years of that continuous grazing to support those 20 beef cows compared to what we need if we're rotating daily or every 3 days. So this is going to just show you that starting to rotate a little bit gets you in the right direction. And the more you're able to rotate, the better, the more you're able to get out of that pasture production wise. This here is data from, actually all this data is from Wisconsin, but this is just looking at the detrimental effect of overgrazing and why we should try to avoid it at all costs. So this is a one-time overgrazing event in October. And then the following grazing season, the yields were tracked through the whole season. And you can see where it was grazed down to 2 inches. So well below that 4-inch recommendation. The yield was depressed by 25% the entirety of the next season, which in turn decreased the stocking rate by 26%. Why that works is you're taking away these, whatever's left is the solar panels that are collecting sunlight and converting that to energy. And the more you take, the less there is there. So that's the first issue. But the second issue is any sunlight these short stubble are collecting is going to restore below ground reserves. So you can actually go multiple weeks, up to 17 days, without seeing any above ground growth because all of the energy being collected is going below ground to restore before it starts. So when we use a decent cutting height in harvested fields with orchard grass, often you see this. You'll see before you even have the windrows removed from the field, the orchard grass is already regrowing, and that's why that happens. So we're maintaining all this in order to try to avoid it looking like this, where it's grazed right down tight to the ground. And this isn't even the worst example. This is maybe just a borderline example. These are just some more data from Wisconsin looking at the same thing. So I converted this one bar here just for a point of reference to standard units. So here, the total season yield under intensive rotational grazing is almost 5 tons of dry matter per acre compared to the white bar, which is continuous grazing. So where you have these crosshatched intensive rotational grazing, you have a 30-day rotation and 6-inch residual. So you have more yield, but you also have 15 to 45% better forage quality here. And those are significant. So you have better yield and better forage quality where you're using the principles of managed grazing. So those are kind of some of the things that make managed grazing work. So now I'm going to just kind of finish this with some examples of how this works. So what are the economic, environmental, and animal outcomes of managed grazing? So you may have seen that there's a case study fact sheet that has been shared around a little bit from a farm in Door County, Wisconsin, who's opened up their numbers, and they've been implementing some grazing of their dairy heifers using a mix of perennial forages and annual cover crop type forages. And so they'll just put a group of 100 heifers out, and They laid out all the numbers, and what it comes down to in the end for those 100 heifers for 180 days on pasture is they saved $27,000 by bringing them outside for a few months. A similar situation in Marathon County. This was using the heifer grazing compass. So we were looking at various amounts of heifers for the different sizes of dairy farms in our area. And we were working with one who has about 100, is a custom heifer raiser and grazes a portion of those animals. And we ground truth these numbers to his, and we came out within pennies. But so 60 animals outside for the grazing season ended up saving around $23,000 for that dairy farm. So that's the economics. What about the environmental impact? This is a fact sheet that was put out a couple of years ago, looking at taking all the research that's been done, looking at the ecosystem services of well-managed grazing and just comparing it to other production systems. And I'm not going to go through all of it real closely here, but just everything from the soil carbon stored in this green column here, the soil erosion reduction, the reduction in phosphorus runoff and nitrate losses, storm water retention or flood reduction, and then also things like grassland bird habitat and pollinator habitat, which may not be directly of interest to a dairy farmer and may not be a primary motive for it, but it matters to someone else in society. And as we start having more and more conversations about putting value to ecosystem services, this stuff may end up benefiting the dairy farmers in the end. And then just one other thing on the environmental component of this. So in the Grassland 2.0 project, there's several what they refer to as learning hubs around Wisconsin, Minnesota, Illinois as well. One of them is right in our neighborhood here, where we call it the Clover Belt Learning Hub. And we're using this Grayscape program to just see how we can plan on hitting the county's phosphorus reduction goals, which are pretty significant reductions in phosphorus. And what we concluded, this is management intensive rotational grazing, and this is cropland with cover crops and no-till. There's no way to hit the erosion and phosphorus loss goals both without a pretty widespread conversion of quite a bit of land to perennial forage, which would also be under management intensive rotational grazing. So we can reduce the erosion with cover crops and no-till, but if we want to reduce the erosion and phosphorus loss, then we're going to need more land under perennial cover. So then lastly, just a couple of things about the animal performance. So these data here from over 10 years ago, but this is being revisited now at the Marshfield Agricultural Research Station. So last year, this trial began. It's going to continue on through this year, comparing dairy heifers raised in confinement to those raised on pasture and tracking them all the way through their second lactation. And where the stars are is where we've got significant differences. You can see the milk yield from those animals, which is largely driven by dry matter intake, which is also greater in those grazed animals. So I often make sure to point out the goal of this isn't necessarily to say, well, grazing is hands down a better way to raise those heifers than in confinement. But to me, what's more important is what this is showing us is when managed right, we can move some of those heifers out to a well-managed pasture and expect the same outcome that we would expect in confinement, that it's possible. And to me, that's a significant story. This is from stockpile grazing, so it's not total season grazing. It's just from a period of time at the end of the grazing season. And all I'm showing this for is to just show a snapshot of how well animals can do on high quality forage on pasture. So this would have been in late October into early November. You can see what kind of daily gains we had on very high quality pastures. So all of that wrapped up. I've just got two more slides here to wrap this up. But when we talk about going back to our roots with grazing and viewing grazing as a solution, what are the next steps? How do we get practical about this? Well, from my perspective as a grazing specialist, I think this is how it goes. And this would be even for someone who says, I don't think this is for me, but maybe I'll do my diligence just to look into it. The first thing to do would be to identify farm-specific opportunities and to seek a trusted specialist. So there's lots of specialists out there. Most of them are very good, but it needs to be someone who you've got some sort of relationship or rapport with, someone who you trust. And work with that person to identify opportunities that fit your operation, because it's going to be different from farm to farm. And then visit with a grazing planner in your area and walk the farm and talk about your goals and how grazing could fit. And then develop a grazing plan that fits those goals and then implement the practice along with peers and mentors. So it's really important to find farmers who are doing this successfully. And then lastly, when we talk about a grazing plan that fits your operational goals, I can't underscore that enough. I'm involved with training grazing planners, and the thing that we talk about more than anything is making sure this grazing plan is tailored to the farm and the farmer loves it and is comfortable with it before it's handed off to them. And so this is just an example of what a grazing plan looks like, but there's sometimes a misconception out there that if you have someone from NRCS or some other grazing planner on your farm and they're going to develop a plan that you have to follow their rules. No, they're going to come onto your farm and listen to you and hear your goals and then develop this plan tailored exactly to those. So that would be the next step in getting grazing on the ground on a specific operation. And with that, I am right at my time limit. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Jason. Really, we appreciate that information. If you have any questions, please just add it in the questions and answer function, please. And at the end of this presentation or the whole presentation, we're gonna have some questions for both the speakers. So now we're gonna talk with Nesli Akdeniz, right? Nesli?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Yep, that's right.
She's an assistant professor and extension specialist in biological system engineering at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Her extension program is based on energy efficient ventilation designed for livestock building, quantifying greenhouse gas emission from pasture, and enhancing air quality inside livestock building. Nesli also holds an adjunct faculty appointment at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, where she runs the Certified Livestock Training Program. Thank you so much, Nesli, for being here. We appreciate this opportunity, and you can start your presentation. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much, Alison, for the introduction. Yes, I'm Nesli Akdeniz. I'm an assistant professor in biological systems engineering, and I have an extension appointment, so I am an extension specialist. So today we will talk about greenhouse gas emissions from dairy pastures, and then we will look at a new way of doing that one. So we use drone and a flying air analyzer. So a little bit background. So Jason already introduced this study to you, but I also want to cover a little bit background. So why are we grazing there? Why are there grazing dairy operations, right? So in the past, all the animals were outside. Now then we put them inside the buildings. Now we are like, wait a minute, maybe it was not that bad idea. Let's take out some of those animals out, right? So this is how it developed over the years. So one benefit is it has higher net income. So according to a study reported here, so it's not higher income, but net income when we look at the expenses and the gains. So there are some water quality benefits. So some land is not meant to be cropland, so it is good to use those land as pastures and graze animals on that one. So we can reduce erosion, we can control the phosphorus runoff a little bit better. There are some climate benefits, right? We are expecting pastures are climate smart practices. So there is carbon sequestration potential there. And there are some biodiversity benefits. It's always good to look at pastures, right? They are green, so it is always fun to look at them. So they are habitat for pollinators and birds. All right, so we already know that one. So we see pastures are a self-sustained system. So they're regenerative agriculture. And the main idea is, since we think of them as, regenerative agriculture or self-sustained systems, 60–80% of the nutrients are recycled back by the animals, right? And then there are legumes, they fix nitrogen. So usually general understanding is we don't need to apply any nutrients to pastures. So, but our rotational grazing handbook, it recommends nutrient application to all pastures with less than 30–40% legume content. So to be able to get that good pasture yield, it is recommended to apply nutrients based on the soil test results, pasture test results, and the target pasture yield. But how do we do that one? And then what are the benefits, right? So what are the potential benefits? So it's a little bit weather dependent. So drought affects this one a lot. But if it is not an extreme drought condition, we can extend the grazing season. So reduce the need for supplemental feed. And then another benefit is once we apply the fertilizer or compost or manure, whatever the nutrient source we are using, nutrients are recycled back into the soil. So it is not like we are applying and they disappear, they are always recycling back. And then if we can increase the pasture yield, then there's a potential to increase the carbon sequestration of the pasture. So one recommendation is split nitrogen applications. So let's say if we are going to apply, it depends on the soil test results, but if we decide to apply 100 pounds per acre, instead of applying all the nutrients in one go in May, having split applications, so applying half of it in May and half of it in August, or even dividing it into 3, so having May, June, and August applications. So what are the benefits? What's the reason? So number one benefit is to reduce the risk of losing nitrogen. So if we apply everything in one go, and then if there is a very heavy rainfall event just after we apply, then we will lose most of the nitrogen through runoff, right? So it will just leak. So to reduce the risk, so we cannot predict the weather conditions. So to reduce the risk, if there is a drought period, then nitrate poisoning, nitrate accumulation might be a problem. So if when we apply, we want that nitrogen to stay inside the soil, right? So it's the ammonium form. So if it is a hot day and if most of the nitrogen applied is emitted as ammonia to the air, then we will lose nitrogen. So we will just lose those nutrients and the value of the nutrients. So the recommendation is to have a split nitrogen application. And in this presentation, I will talk about a little bit what are the benefits on the air emissions. So when we look at the greenhouse gases, so we know, we are very familiar, so we heard about them many, many times, right? CO2, methane, and nitrous oxide. So nitrous oxide is a nitrogen-containing greenhouse gas. So when we think about nitrogen fertilizer application or compost application or manure application, it does affect nitrous oxide emissions. So what are the precursors? So these are not direct greenhouse gases, but they are converted to ammonia and NOx. They are converted to N2O. So we are also worried about that one, right? Ammonia and NOx. And then there are some indirect greenhouse gases that we don't talk about them much. So probably maybe you never heard about them, right? So PM, particulate matter. So they have cooling or warming effects. So we used to call it like global warming, but now we are not allowed to say it global warming. We call it climate change. It's not just warming, it is also cooling and the change in the climate, right? So H2S, so it is oxidized, so it also has some warming effects. Total volatile organic compounds, they also have some warming effects. They are not recognized as greenhouse gases, but in my opinion, they shouldn't be ignored. They are indirect greenhouse gases. All right, so how did we do this one? So first thing we did, so we have this drone aircraft. So it is a little bit bigger than that. You know, I think by now everyone has one drone at home. We used to take pictures. So it is a little bit bigger than those small size drones. So our first step was to get a remote pilot license. So, and then now we are required to have a remote ID. So it is already in effect. So we have a tag that is attached to the drone. So we broadcast our real-time location. So we have a license, we have the tag, and then we have the records and all the flights. So, and then the study was based on field measurements in Marshfield Ag Research Station. So just like Jason mentioned, so there are a lot of pastures in Marshfield and they are kind of controlled environments. So they are excellent research station. So what we did is like most of the greenhouse gas emissions, those estimates, they're based on modeling. So there are some equations and they just estimate based on those equations. They are thinking that from this pasture, this much air emissions should be coming out. What we did, we attached an air analyzer to a drone, and I will show that picture in a second. So we just scanned the whole surface of the pasture. So we could grab samples using dynamic flux chambers or static flux chambers, but instead of doing that one, we did real-time sampling, and we scanned the whole surface of the pasture. So this is what it looks like. It's we call it flying air analyzer. So it is DR2000. So it is very compact size. It is only 800 grams. So this is our drone DJI Inspire 2, and this is its capacity. So it is a big drone, but it's not such a big drone. So it cannot carry a heavy air analyzer. So it is like compact enough so that we could attach it and it could work. So this is how it looks like. So we have a air sampling probe. So it's number 5. It attached a wind sensor, and it also serves like an air sampling probe. And then we can also attach a flex foil air bag for air sampling. So what we did, we collected samples, we scanned the whole surface. This is real time. And then the data was sent to the cloud. And when we went back to the lab, we were able to just download the data. What we did, we also, during the flights, we collected back samples, and then we brought those back samples to the lab and analyzed in the lab using a GC. So we try to have some quality control, match that data with the data we have in the lab, so that, you know, we are sure we are not overestimating the air emissions. So it is a very compact size air analyzer, but there is a lot of sensors in it and a lot of things are going on. So we have the VOC sensor, methane, NOx, H2S, ammonia, CO2, PM. So probably you heard about PM 2.5, PM 10. There's also one more PM we call PM 1. It's very small particles. We have those 3 of them. There is a fan that is, you know, drawing the air through so that these sensors can work. And there is also data acquisition system so that it records the data and sends to the cloud server, and then we can download from the cloud server. So also we measure the temperature, barometric pressure, wind direction, and wind speed, so that we can calculate our emission rates. And there is a weather station in Marshfield, so we can also compare our data. So there are a lot of quality control steps in this research. So one concern was like, it needs to go straight, drone needs to go straight. And if you're operating a drone, you know, it's not always possible. So there is an app we use, so we fly, our flights were at a constant speed and at a constant height. So if we change our road each time we collect samples, then it will affect our sampling and results. So here you can see these 3, 3, 3. So each time the drone goes and collects 3 samples from that location. So it is very stable. So it's kind of difficult to achieve. So we spent some time to do that one. So it's very stable. It goes straight and collects at a constant speed the samples. So we can, once we scan the whole surface, then we have like homogeneous data. Okay, so this is how a closer look. So when we look at the drone, so this is the air analyzer attached. So we can we attach an air sample, a sampling bag. So there's a button, so we can just hit that button and say, okay, now stop real-time sampling. Now start filling up that air bag. So we filled up the air bag and brought the bag to the lab, and in the lab using a GCFID ECD with different detectors, we were able to also sample, quantify those concentrations of those gases. All right, so when we first started, the first concern, okay, so this is a drone and there's a propeller, right? And this propeller kind of generates wind, right? So they call it propeller downwash. So we are talking about air emissions, right? How is it going to affect our air emissions? How is it going to affect our measurements? Okay, so are we going to just go ahead and dilute our you know, samples that we are collecting, or are we going to be fine? So there is something called this sampling probe. So it's an 88 centimeter sampling probe. So there are 2 pieces, 44 and 44. So I don't know why they are specifically developed like 88 centimeter, why not 90? But what this sampling probe does is, when it is heading to upwind, so it is very important, it is heading to upwind, then our sampling is not affected by the downwash. So in this picture, you can see the downwash, where the downwash is happening. So sampling probe is far away from the downwash. So pastures are non-point resource source, but like here we have a point source. If you have a point source, then our sampling is not affected. So yeah, the idea is a box model, we call it. So what we are assuming is these are very, very like micro-sized boxes. So inside that micro-sized box, conditions are stable. So we call it steady state. So the drone is moving from one box to another box to another box to another box. And then we have data for all those boxes. So it is called box model. And once we have that data, by using interpolation, we can prepare these maps. So they are called air emission map. So we use kriging interpolation. So there's a software called ArcGIS Pro, you might be familiar with. So we can generate these kind of emission rate maps showing the whole pasture surface. So one problem was the drought in 2023. So I don't have the whole set of data, but we will be collecting more samples this summer. So some pastures shut down early. So in August, we were not able to collect as much data as we wanted to. But yeah, more data will be coming this summer, hopefully. It's all weather dependent. But I will share with you some preliminary results. So what we found was that when we collect the samples, the average temperature was around 28 degrees C, which is average temperature for Wisconsin. So conditions were like okay for Wisconsin. Wind speed, we purposely collected our samples when it is not windy. So our wind speed was low and it is from southwest. So it is very common for, again, Wisconsin or for Midwest to have a southwest wind in summer. One thing that we really paid attention was cows were comfortable having a drone around. So if they were, not comfortable, if they were trying to escape, jumping and hopping around, then it would affect our air emissions. So I think cows' eyesight is not that good. So they didn't even notice there was a drone around. So they just continued their daily routine. So they didn't mind having a drone around. So it is another quality control parameter we had. So when we look at the CO2 concentrations and ammonia concentrations, they were slightly higher than the atmospheric level concentrations, which is as expected since there's a pasture, there's manure, there are animals, right? So this is what we kind of were expecting to see, slightly higher than the atmospheric levels. So again, H2S concentrations were slightly higher. So there was some considerable amount of PM, particulate matter, dust emissions. So PM1, PM2.5, PM10. So they were a little bit about there are California standards for these kind of emissions. Total VOCs, they were within the range. Nitrous, NOx concentrations, they were kind of higher than the recommended levels. So methane and N2O concentrations were also slightly higher than the atmospheric levels. So now we are looking at those maps, okay? So there's sampling 1, sampling 2, sampling 3, 4, and 5. We are looking at the CO2 emission rate data here. So it is milligram per second per meter square pasture. So sampling 1 is just following the fertilizer application, and there are a lot of factors that are affecting these emission rates, and we are in the process of developing those correlations. So one is the pasture yield, another one is the location of the animals. So this was a rotationally grazed pasture. So where the animals are located on that specific day, we are collecting samples. It doesn't matter, especially for CO2 emissions. So here we are looking at the ammonia emissions following fertilizer application. Ammonia emission rates increase as expected. How much it increased? So we are trying to document that one and having a database that shows if we apply this much nitrogen fertilizer or if we apply this much manure that is containing this much nitrogen inside, how much does it affect the ammonia emissions and how is it related to the weather conditions? So if it is a windy day, if it's a hot summer day, then it increases the ammonia emissions and nitrogen loss through ammonia emissions. And then this is PM 2.5 I put as an example. So I have these maps for all days, all sampling days and all gases and the particulate matters we collected. Again, there are different things that are affecting PM emissions. So the amount of activity we are having around the farm, right? All those farm vehicles that are moving around, they do have an impact on PM emissions. Also fertilizer application, some particles are converted to dust particles, so they do have an impact on PM emissions. So what is next? So we don't have that solid results yet. So the study continues. So hopefully we will have a little bit, drought will not be such a big concern this summer. So we will have a little bit more complete data this summer. So we continue testing split nutrient applications. So I have that dream of trying, different species, dairy, beef, sheep, so that having a, full set of data, not just for one species, but full set of data. So, and then I really want to compare the continuous grazing versus rotational grazing. How does it affect? Since when I say our concentrations were slightly higher than the atmospheric levels, sometimes there is a reaction like, why it is just slightly higher? You should have much higher. But it really depends on the management system, right? So if all manure accumulates in one location, you will have more air emissions from that location. But if it is spread uniformly through the pasture, then the emission rates will go down. And the ultimate goal of this study is to develop a database for GHG emissions from pastures. So we are not there yet, but if we ever have a chance to gain carbon credit from pastures, then we want to make sure that we have enough data to support you so that, pastures are known as climate smart practices. So it is good to have this database so that we can support you and then you can earn those carbon credits. And then, just quick two acknowledgements. So the study is, run by my PhD student, Toy Young, and it is funded by the Wisconsin Fertilizer Research Council. And then with that, I want to stop here. Maybe I should continue sharing. So, Alison, do you want to take over from here?
Yeah. So right now we are just waiting for some questions. So if you have any questions, please just type it right now so we can have a discussion right now. If you don't have questions, I have a question to Jason. What do you think about like the silvopastorales programs? I don't know if we do that or not. Like I'm from Colombia and we do that a lot, and we have a lot of pasture cows over there. So I just want to know like what is that program here?
Did you say silvopasture?
Yeah, silvopastoral.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's in the grazing community, that's a topic that is pretty high on the list right now. There's a lot of interest. There's a couple organizations who are taking the lead on that. Savannah Institute is one who's really investing a lot. They've got people who are grazing specialists who their main area of focus is silvopasture. So there is research in Wisconsin that's kind of building in this database, and I think that follows the same trend of what I was talking about before. A lot of people who don't understand what well-managed silvopasture is kind of think you want to dump these animals in the woods and have them there for the summer and hope that they turn out okay. And that's not what silvopasture is. Silvopasture is like very well managed, intentionally for grazing livestock. And so there's a huge difference there. I think, every time we experience a summer like last summer where we've got extreme heat and dryness, silvopasture will even prove to be more valuable. I think it has the potential to be a really good place for animals that are on pasture when we hit those extreme conditions to have as even like a contingency plan. So I think there's a ton of potential there. So.
Okay, well, good to know. And I have a question for Nesli. So if, for example, a dairy owner, they want to contact you because they want to, like improve their ventilations and see how much like methane they are producing, the cows. So how they can contact you or how they can be, I don't know if you research, you need some dairies that participate on those programs. So
Yes, we are always looking for new sites. Please reach out. That will be awesome. So here, more than ventilation, what we do is like nutrient application, so fertilizer application or manure application, and how does it affect their ammonia emissions, and why do they worry about ammonia emissions? So there are two reasons, right? One is the ammonia emission means they're losing nitrogen, which means they're losing money, right? And the second one is there are some environmental concerns, right? We are trying to minimize ammonia emissions so that that ammonia doesn't go ahead and be converted to a greenhouse gas. And then we just want to get that carbon credit or all those benefits, or we want to get the, be known as like, sustainable agriculture, regenerative agriculture. Those are all like climate smart practices, carbon sequestration. They're all, popular terms in these days. So this is the goal of the study. And if anyone interested in, I will be glad to visit their site. So we just bring a drone, not a huge one, a medium size, let's call it, an air analyzer attached. And it's always fun to watch. People usually like watching it. So if they don't mind having us on their site, we will be happy to visit.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you, Nesli. Thank you, Jason, to be here. Thank you, everybody, to be here. If you have any other questions, please reach out to any of the dairy educators, and see you next month, on the third Tuesday at 11 a.m. Thank you so much and have a great day.